Hello everybody, my name is Jillian Kurdick. I'm an undergraduate student at Clark University where I study engineering management, and here with me is...
I'm Izzy Grasso. I'm also an undergraduate student at Clark University, and I am studying data science. And today we are here to talk to you about COVID-19 related misinformation across English, Farsi, and Chinese in the US, Iran, and China, and across different platforms. It's also important to note that the group of authors on this paper include native speakers of English, Farsi, and Chinese who were raised in the US, Iran, and China, but are all authors that are currently working in the US today.
To start out, I want to go over a quick outline of our presentation. So we're going to start with definitions and background to provide context for the paper. Then we're going to move on to the purpose and the methodology, finishing with the results, key takeaways, and future work. So let's get started with some shared language. The first definition is misinformation, which is incorrect information created without the intention of causing harm. Next is disinformation, which is incorrect information and intentionally created to hurt an individual, a group, or a country. Next is malinformation, which is correct information based on reality, but used to cause harm to an individual, a group, or a country. Due to the difficult nature of differentiating between these categories, we will call everything misinformation as an umbrella term. Now, let's provide some background. We currently live in the age of misinformation. The rapid growth of the internet, particularly social media, has led to an explosion of information online that is extremely difficult to determine its accuracy. This has resulted in widespread confusion and distrust of media and other sources of information. Some examples of misinformation are 2020 U.S. election integrity, disbelief of Sandy Hook, climate change denial, which ties into the skepticism of the scientific community, and lastly, COVID and public health, which is what we'll be focusing on today. We look specifically into misinformation on social media. And you might ask, why social media? And that is because social media algorithms are designed to keep you online as long as possible, which leads to personalized news feeds, and those lead to a hotbed of misinformation and echo chambers. Studying this problem on a global scale is incredibly complex with differing governments and regulation of media and information. Differing cultural values and differing preferences and use of platforms, each with their own community, guidelines, and algorithms. I currently cannot see the PowerPoint. Is that still true for everybody else?
We're getting reports of echo in the chat. I wonder if when each of you is not speaking, if you can mute and unmute. Given the troubles we just had with muting and unmuting, it also might be a recipe for trouble, but maybe let's give it a try. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. I only have a little bit further, so now more than ever, we are experiencing an increase in social media usage. With the great impact that COVID-19 has left on society, people were isolated in 2020. And their sense of community and connection has relied increasingly on the use of social media. We see this with an explosion of new users and also new platforms. And also to reiterate, social media algorithms are designed for the user and to keep the user online. They achieve this by tailoring their feeds to things they like and creating personalized news feeds with these echo chambers amplifying misinformation, and has led to serious consequences. And finally, despite the increase in fact-checking initiatives, they've struggled to debunk false claims surrounding COVID-19 globally. Now, moving on to the purpose. The purpose of this research is to explore COVID-19 related information across different languages and platforms. Now, there are big differences in misinformation around the world. So we look to understand how the different types of misinformation experienced around the world are different in different countries and in different languages. We focus on 3 languages as examples: English, Farsi, and Chinese. We have people on our team, as mentioned before, who are native speakers of English, Farsi, and Chinese, and who were raised in the U.S., Iran, and China, and currently all live in the U.S. It is difficult to know for sure where the post originated from, given the way we sampled, but we are focused on posts generated in the U.S., Iran, and China. Finally, we will categorize the content, topics, and roots of misinformation across all 3 languages.
All right, so now on to the methodology. We used an opportunistic sampling technique, meaning the members of the population are chosen based on their access, and sampling decisions were made during the process of collecting data across the platforms listed in the table here, and we used a qualitative approach where we categorized misinformation in all 3 languages. To orient you to the table, social media platforms with a check mark are, the check mark means commonly used. The X is for not allowed or blocked, and boxes that have both are for they're not allowed, but they are accessible. S is for seldom used, and the question mark is for a situation that is undetermined by us. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Weibo, WeChat, and TikTok are the most popular social media platforms in China, Iran, and the US. However, all platforms in this study support both keyword and hashtag search. Although all platforms in this study support both keyword and hashtag search, they are used differently across different platforms. For example, unlike hashtags on American platforms, a hashtag on Weibo is owned by a host, and each hashtag has its own unique web page. Super topics on Weibo related to COVID-19 are state-owned media. It's also important to note that China has very strict technical and legal measures in prohibiting access to Twitter. So almost all tweets in Chinese are posted by Chinese speakers outside mainland China, and therefore not a good representation of the social media landscape within China. WhatsApp has become a makeshift social media platform in Iran with group chats including thousands of members. In Iran, although there are many bans, people still use VPN and proxy anti-filter apps and tools to access blocked social media. However, this is sort of inequitable in access because it requires some technical expertise. The U.S. is largely seen as, quote, the Wild West, unquote, when it comes to tech regulation, meaning that we are largely seen as underregulated, but it is important to note that there were threats in the U.S. to ban TikTok at one point. So next, what we did is we categorized misinformation by topics. So these topics included cures of COVID-19, the origin of COVID-19, testing, so this might include availability of testing, medical testing kits created by different countries, and unconventional non-medical methods for testing. We had vaccines, prevention methods for the public, so this includes misinformation topics such as safety and effectiveness of vaccines. The public was including topics concerning public and macro policies, where for the individual, this might include traditional, superstitious, fake, or ineffective methods of prevention identified as individual or personal actions. Misinformation surrounding the number of deaths and confirmed cases. Rumors about other countries, which we state are often xenophobic and external to a country. So this could include conspiracy theories and rumors spread about other countries and roles related to the new virus. Virus transmission, and others. And this can include a variety of topics that were not common across all 3 languages. We also categorized the roots of misinformation as some people would maybe see as the source of misinformation. So here we have 6 different categories. Political related roots, so this would be a source from a government or politician. Medical and science would be from a doctor or a nurse or someone claiming to be a medical expert. We have celebrities in pop culture, religious-related roots, criminal-related roots, so that would be a statement which has been claimed by a scammer or hackers for criminal purposes, such as fraud or access to personal information. And again, others for statements that cannot be substantiated to be related to the mentioned above categories, including hoaxes, jokes, and other undesignated misinformation. So starting here, we're going to be looking at the roots of misinformation across all three languages. And so here on each table, or each plot, we have the number of rumors or the frequency of misinformation pieces and their categories. The first thing to note is that politics was the top source of misinformation in all three languages, meaning that politicians and governments are the main source of misinformation. But what is talked about is very different in each language. The current politically polarized atmosphere in the United States is a major driver of misinformation. Misinformation in the USA is commonly in the form of counter-expertise or the rejection of mainstream academic expertise. Misinformation related to politics is often fabricated to create confirmation bias among readers, subsequently leading to heightened in-group and party identification and polarization. And finally, COVID-19 misinformation spread by political figures in the USA may be a symptom of deflection and scapegoating due to inadequate administrative response. Where in China, in Chinese, the COVID-19 misinformation circulating on social media reflects significant differences in political systems between China and the Western world. For such reasons, misinformation from the Western world is translated, filtered, and reflected in Chinese social media. When considering Chinese social media, it is important to consider the systems of aggressive censorship in China that result in strict politically filtered internet. For this reason, the percentage of misinformation with criminal roots is 0% in Chinese. Global misinformation, which has been translated and reflected in Chinese social media environment, can be considered to be politically biased since the vast majority of social media in China is tightly controlled by the state. Two major reasons have been identified for creating and spreading misinformation in Iran. First, discourse about COVID-19 is politically manipulated by the government, and second, official religious figures have interfered with COVID-19 related issues, and religion has been a barrier for ordinary hardliners to be unbiased. Iran also has a controlling and conservative government which micromanages all aspects of people's lives. This characteristic of the government politicizes every subject, including the handling of COVID-19. Thus, it is not surprising that much of the COVID-19 misinformation found in Farsi has political roots. So here we're talking about the topics by each language. And again, we can see the frequency of each topic and in each language. So to start, the top three topics of the collected misinformation mostly concern the individual behavior. In a few cases, the same claim has been reported in more than one category. So for example, drinking bleach is both been circulating as a cure and a prevention method. So that's important to note as you're looking at this data here. The high proportion of misinformation within the context of the individual behavior verifies the vulnerability of users to misinformation to cope with uncertainty and uncontrollability of the pandemic circumstances. And the top two categories for both Farsi and English are prevention, individual, and virus transmission. This suggests that the Iranian laws, coupled with weak enforcement, still allows misinformation of a similar kind to flow in Iran as in the USA, with fewer laws and restrictions. We also observed a larger variety of topics in English, which explains the relatively higher percentage of English misinformation categorized as others. For instance, misinformation related to contact tracing could only be found in the USA. One of the reasons could be the fact that some laws and rules vary from one state to another in the USA. For example, misinformation about federal and state compensation and other topics. And this confusing landscape of varying laws opens up space for misinformation to flow. It's important to note that the greatest difference in English and Farsi belongs to the category of misinformation related to other countries, where in Chinese and Farsi, misinformation within this category have similar records. Since most of the Chinese and Farsi rumors about other countries have political roots, and considering the controlling government in Iran and China, such similarity is not surprising. Finally, a decent amount of Chinese misinformation is to make the misinformation in the US look ridiculous. So specifically, the strategy was to use misinformation in the US that was already debunked. such as, again, drinking bleach is a cure. So this was widely spread throughout the US, but it was quickly debunked. But in China, it was spread through social media to make the US look ridiculous. Again, it's important to remember that because of the state control of the media, this is misinformation that the Chinese government wanted to spread. So what are some key takeaways? Largely in all three countries, the source of misinformation was the government or politicians. English and Farsi misinformation samples have more in common in terms of the topic of misinformation than Chinese, specifically regarding the actions of the individual. The difference in how government controls on social media platforms drives users to specific platforms with different infrastructure for tracking and controlling misinformation. So again, I would remind you of when we were looking at that table. In Iran, that might be the technical capability of someone to access a blocked social media platform, or just bans on social media in general will impact the choices that people make and what social media platforms they're using. The absence of misinformation with criminal roots and fewer categories of misinformation overall in Chinese social media is notable and points out the trade-off in the control of misinformation versus freedom of speech. A key challenge going forward for all societies and countries will be determining how to control misinformation without silencing the voices needed to hold governments accountable. And understanding how different countries utilize social media and their restrictions gives better insight as to how to regulate disruptive behavior. Overall, it is clear how focusing beyond English, beyond the USA, and beyond USA-based social media platforms are essential for providing a clear understanding of the effects of misinformation and the effectiveness of misinformation control strategies around the world. And so what is our future work? Currently, we're working on quantifying political polarization on social media, particularly of politicians in the United States. We plan to apply these techniques to other populations, specifically groups that are most vulnerable to misinformation. And we will also be exploring the impact of mainstream media outlets, both in the spread of misinformation and political polarization on and offline. Thank you for coming to our talk. This is our research group, and if you we'll be addressing these questions soon. And I just want to also note here that if you are interested in collaborating or have future questions, please contact Gulshan Majaki, and I have her email highlighted here. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's working. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we have one question. I hear the echo. We have one question from Bettina Byron for this last paper. So I read the question and then let me know who will answer. I will unmute the microphone. So I'm reading. Could you say some more about your coding process and in particular the code book? In particular, how do you determine intentionality of the incorrectness? Your defining feature is misinformation. How do you determine the roots? Do you need different code books for the different language cultures? I hope I did this correctly. Who is going to answer? Are you or?
I can start, but I think Gulshan will probably want to expand on this. So in terms of the intentionality, it is important to note that sometimes it's almost impossible or it's extremely difficult to determine the intentionality. So as we stated, disinformation would be with having and intentionally spreading false information, where misinformation would be unintentional. So we use misinformation as an umbrella term when we don't know the intentionality, which is why we specifically use that word. And we can, I think Gulshan can expand more about the coding process in the code book as well as the sampling process.
Thank you so much for the question. That was a really good question. So that was like experimental work more than quantitative work, and this is just the preliminary results for our next papers. So as we said, we started with the opportunistic sampling, and we collected our data based on what we can find in different platforms based on the nature of the platforms. So again, that's going to be like a really short form of the answers. I hope I answered your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. There is another small question below. How did you sample the post? Do you have reason to believe the sampling might have had an influence bias? For the same paper, of course.
Yes. Again, this was as opportunistic sampling, which does it's a non-probabilistic sampling method. So we do have reason to believe that it introduces bias. And so, as Gulshan was mentioning, this is what we could find based on our team. So we had people who are English native speakers and in the U.S. looking through commonly used English platforms for English misinformation, where our native speaker of Farsi from Iran is looking in Farsi, and a native speaker of Chinese from China is looking in Chinese based on their access to social media. So it was opportunistic in that way, that it was based on what we could access. So it is non-probabilistic, meaning that there is expected bias.
Thank you very much. I don't see other question for the previous two papers, so I think we can have, now there is another question. I'm reading. When you say from Roberto Ulloa, when you say the politicians are the source of misinformation, does it mean they actually come up with the content, or they just broadcast existent ideas?
So it can be both. So, for example, we used the famous bleach example. That was something that a politician came up with. But there are other examples in which politicians are just amplifying misinformation that are coming from other sources. I don't know if Gulshan, you want to expand on that at all.
Yes, that's right. So we consider how the misinformation get viral. That's the main source. So maybe somebody unfamous started with the misinformation, but the fact that the person caused the virality is the main source of misinformation.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's interrupt for 10 minutes. We are late. Maybe we can have a 5 minutes break instead of 10 minutes. If you are okay, we can meet in 5-6 minutes here. So see you later. And if you have any question in the meantime, you can write in the chat, and maybe the authors can read the chat and answer in the chat. So you can continue the discussion, of course. See you in 5 minutes then.
I don't know if you're still on the Sparrow, but I can just mention that we used hashtag and keyword to filter the posts.
Thank you very much.